It all started on a Friday, the kind of day where everyone's in a rush to get home, excited for the weekend. But not me. I had a massive test coming up on Monday. One of those tests where just looking at the study guide makes you panic because you know you haven't absorbed anything. So, while everyone else was packing up and bolting out the doors, I decided to stay behind in the school library. I figured I'd have a couple of hours to study in peace. No distractions, no friends trying to drag me into plans I wasn't in the mood for. Just me, my books, and maybe some bad cafeteria coffee to keep me awake. By the time I settled into one of the back tables in the library, the place was dead quiet. The last bell had rung, and the usual chaos of slamming lockers and chattering students had faded into complete silence. I actually thought it'd be nice, just me and the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. I threw on my headphones, plugged in some lo-fi music, and started to dive into my notes. Time seemed to disappear. I was so focused that I didn't even notice how empty the school was getting. I must have been there for at least an hour when I finally looked up from my notebook and realized something. The school felt too quiet. You know that feeling when it's so silent you can practically hear your own thoughts? Like, the air feels heavier somehow, almost like the building itself is holding its breath. I pulled my headphones off and just sat there listening. The ticking of the clock on the library wall sounded unnaturally loud, and the hum of the lights was suddenly really annoying. I looked out through the library's big windows into the hallway, completely empty. That's when I noticed the light outside was starting to fade. It was already getting late, and I hadn't even realized how long I'd been sitting there, buried in my notes. I shrugged it off. I mean, it's an old school, right? It's gonna make weird noises when it's empty. No big deal. Besides, I had bigger things to worry about, like passing that test. I went back to my books, trying to ignore the creeping feeling of unease in the back of my mind. But then, the silence was broken. It was faint, barely noticeable at first. A creak, like a door opening somewhere down the hall. I froze, my pen hovering over the page, and listened harder. The sound stopped. Everything went still again, but my heart was racing now. I looked around the empty library, trying to laugh it off. Maybe it was just the janitor doing his rounds, or a teacher locking up their classroom. Nothing weird, right? I grabbed my phone to check the time, 6:45 p.m. The place was probably empty by now, except for maybe a few staff still wrapping up. Still, I couldn't shake that feeling that something was off. The school shouldn't be this quiet. Usually, there's at least the sound of someone moving around, locking up, or closing classrooms, but right now, it was just nothing. I tried to get back to studying, but now I couldn't focus. My mind kept wandering back to that noise. And it wasn't just the creak that was bugging me. It was how isolated it felt. Like it didn't belong here in the empty school. I kept glancing toward the library door, half expecting someone to walk in, but no one did. I shook my head, trying to snap out of it. Come on, you're just tired, I told myself. It's nothing. So I put my headphones back in and tried to get back to work, but something about the silence outside the library stuck with me. It felt wrong, like there was something waiting just out of sight. I'd like to say I calmed down after telling myself it was nothing, but I didn't. You know how, once you notice something creepy, it's impossible to shake that feeling? Yeah, that was me sitting there with my notes in front of me, pretending to focus, but my mind was somewhere else entirely. Every little sound the building made felt louder, more deliberate, like it was trying to get my attention. And no matter how much I tried to brush it off, I kept glancing toward the library doors. About 15 minutes passed, and just when I thought I was getting back into study mode, I heard it again. This time, it was a little louder. It wasn't just a creak. It was more like something moving, something dragging. The noise echoed from down the hall outside the library, and I instantly pulled my headphones off again, my heart doing that weird fast slow thing where you're not sure if you should be scared or just irritated at yourself for being paranoid. I stayed perfectly still listening. The dragging sound stopped, but the silence that followed was even worse than the noise. It was so quiet that I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning kicking in. The kind of silence where your own breathing seems too loud. This wasn't my imagination. Something or someone was definitely out there. My first thought was that it was the janitor doing his rounds. The guy usually came around to clean the classrooms and halls around this time, so maybe he was just pulling his cart or moving something. But something about the noise didn't sit right. It wasn't rhythmic like someone pushing a cart. It was uneven like something heavy was being dragged across the floor, then stopping, then starting again. I felt a chill creep up my spine, but I tried to laugh it off. "It's just the janitor," I muttered under my breath. "Don't be stupid." But even as I said it, I couldn't bring myself to believe it. I glanced at my phone, checking the time again. 7:05 p.m. It wasn't that late, but the sky outside had turned a deep shade of purple, and the few windows in the library weren't letting in much light anymore. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered for a second, which only added to the whole creepy vibe of the empty school. Part of me wanted to get up and check the hallway just to see if anyone was out there. But the other part, the smarter part, told me to stay put. I mean, I didn't want to come face to face with some random person in an empty school, right? Especially if it turned out to be some weirdo or worse, no one at all. So I stayed where I was, convincing myself that it was fine, that I was just being ridiculous. I tried to force myself back into study mode, but it was no use. My eyes kept drifting to the door, half expecting someone or something to walk in. Then it happened again. Another noise. This time it was clearer. Footsteps. Faint, but unmistakable. The sound of shoes clicking against the linoleum floor, like someone walking slowly just outside the library doors. I felt my pulse quicken, and my throat tightened as I listened closely. The footsteps grew louder, then stopped. My heart was in my throat now. I stood up, my legs feeling weak, and cautiously walked toward the door. I peeked through the small window on the door, scanning the hallway. Nothing. The hall was completely empty, just dimly lit by the overhead lights that cast long shadows across the floor. I stared out into the corridor, waiting for any sign of movement, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no criaking, no dragem. Just dead silence. I started to feel silly. Of course, there's nothing out there. It was probably just the janitor like I'd thought. Or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me after sitting in the quiet for so long. It was weird being alone in a place that was usually so full of noise and people. Schools aren't supposed to be empty, right? They're supposed to be loud, chaotic, filled with the sound of chatter and lockers slamming. But this place was like a tomb. I was just about to turn away from the door when I saw something, just a quick flicker of movement at the far end of the hallway. My breath caught in my throat, and I squinted through the window, trying to see more clearly. But the hallway was still empty. I swallowed hard, telling myself I must have imagined it. My brain was probably messing with me because of the silence and the weird noises. Yeah, that had to be it. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I stepped away from the door and sat back down at my table, my heart still racing. I pulled out my phone again, checking my messages, hoping for some kind of distraction. Maybe I could call someone, tell them to swing by, and pick me up so I wouldn't have to walk home alone. But my screen was empty. No new notifications. Great. I sat there for a few more minutes, forcing myself to stay calm. "It's nothing," I kept repeating in my head. "You're just being paranoid." But no matter how much I tried to push the fear away, it kept creeping back in, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Then, as if the universe decided I hadn't had enough, the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't just blink. They flickered twice, then dimmed before buzzing back to full brightness. My stomach dropped. I decided then that I needed to leave. Now, I shoved my books into my backpack, moving faster than I probably needed to, but I didn't care. Every fiber of my being was telling me to get out of there, and fast. I wasn't sticking around any longer. That eerie flicker of the lights was enough to push me over the edge. I needed to get out of the library, out of the school, and head home. Studying for the test was no longer on my mind. It was all about getting away from whatever was happening in this creepy, silent building. I slung my backpack over my shoulder, grabbed my phone, and headed straight for the library doors. My heart was pounding in my chest, and my breathing was uneven, but I kept telling myself, asterisk, it's just the wind or the old pipes. You're being paranoid, Star. But something deep inside me kept saying otherwise. It wasn't just paranoia, it was the feeling that someone was there. I reached for the library door handle, ready to make a run for it. As soon as I opened the door, that same dragging sound came again, echoing down the hallway. It wasn't faint this time. It was louder, closer. My whole body tensed up, and I froze in place, my hand still on the door. I didn't want to, but I couldn't help it. I had to look. I leaned forward, just enough to peek into the dimly lit hallway outside the library. Empty. The hallway stretched out in front of me, long and deserted, with the same dull fluorescent lights casting eerie shadows on the floor. No sign of movement, no sign of anyone, but the dragging sound was still there, unmistakable. It came from somewhere just around the corner, like someone was pulling something heavy across the linoleum floor. My skin prickled with goosebumps, and my mouth went dry. I took a deep breath and forced myself to step out into the hallway. My footsteps sounded too loud, echoing down the empty corridor. I turned in the direction of the noise, telling myself I'd just take a quick look. If I saw the janitor or anyone else, I'd laugh at myself for being so scared. I just needed to see something that made sense. I made my way down the hall, each step slower than the last. The further I went, the louder the sound became, but still, no sign of anyone. The sound of dragging was almost rhythmic now, like whatever was making it was moving in slow, deliberate pulls. I swallowed hard, feeling the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Just as I reached the corner, the dragging sound stopped. Complete silence. Not a single noise. Not even the hum of the lights or the distant murmur of the air conditioning. It was as if the building itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make the next move. I stood there frozen, my heart pounding in my ears. I didn't want to look around the corner. I didn't want to see what was making that sound. But I couldn't just stand there forever, paralyzed with fear. Gathering whatever courage I had left, I forced myself to take the last few steps and peek around the corner. Nothing. The hallway stretched out in front of me, as empty and lifeless as before. There was no one there. No janitor, no students, no teachers. Just rows of lockers and classroom doors, all locked and closed for the night. I let out a shaky breath, trying to calm myself down. Okay, you're just hearing things, I whispered under my breath, trying to convince myself. You've been here too long, and your brain's playing tricks on you. But even as I stood there, staring at the empty hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Very wrong. I turned back toward the library, deciding that it was time to leave. Now! But as soon as I turned, I heard it. Footsteps. They were faint at first, but they were there. The unmistakable sound of shoes hitting the floor, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere behind me. I froze, my blood turning to ice. The footsteps grew louder, closer, echoing off the walls of the hallway. I turned around slowly, my heart racing, expecting to see someone, anyone, walking toward me. But the hallway was empty. No one was there, yet the footsteps continued. Panic surged through me. This wasn't normal. I was hearing something that wasn't there, something that shouldn't be there. My breathing grew shallow, and I backed up a few steps, my eyes darting around the hallway, searching for any explanation, any sign that this was just my imagination. But the footsteps were real, too real. And then they stopped. Dead silence again, like the whole building was waiting for what would happen next. I stood there, my body tense, every muscle ready to bolt. I didn't want to move, didn't want to turn my back on whatever was behind me, but I knew I couldn't just stand there. I had to leave. I spun around and started walking, fast, my footsteps echoing down the hall. I kept my eyes straight ahead, refusing to look back, even though every instinct in my body was telling me to run. The sound of my own footsteps felt deafening in the quiet, but at least they were mine. At least I was in control. I was almost at the doors leading to the main hallway when the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't just blink. They flickered twice, then dimmed, and for a terrifying few seconds, the hallway was plunged into complete darkness. I stopped, frozen in place, my heart racing. I held my breath, listening, waiting for the lights to come back on. The darkness was suffocating, pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. I couldn't see anything, couldn't even tell if there was anyone in the hallway with me. My phone screen was the only light, casting a faint glow around me. And then, just as suddenly as they had gone out, the lights flickered back on. But something was different. In the brief moment of darkness, I had heard something. something that wasn't my own footsteps. A shuffling sound like fabric brushing against the floor. And when the lights came back, I noticed something else. A shadow. Faint, but there. At the far end of the hallway, near one of the classroom doors. I blinked, my mind racing. There was no one there. I had just checked. But now, standing in the distance, was the unmistakable outline of a figure. Tall, motionless, barely visible in the dim light. I couldn't breathe. I stood there, staring at the shadow, too terrified to move. My mind was screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't cooperate. The figure didn't move, didn't come toward me. It just stood there watching. For what felt like an eternity, I stood frozen, waiting for it to do something. Anything. But it remained still, as if it was waiting for me to make the first move. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. I needed to get out of here. Now, summoning every ounce of courage I had left, I turned and sprinted toward the exit. I ran down the hallway like my life depended on it, because in that moment it felt like it did. My feet pounded against the linoleum, and my backpack bounced painfully against my back, but I didn't care. All I could think about was putting as much distance as possible between me and that shadow. My heart was racing, adrenaline pumping through my veins. I wasn't just scared, I was terrified. Every few steps, I risked a glance behind me, half expecting to see that figure coming after me. But every time I looked back, the hallway was empty, as if the shadow had never been there at all. No footsteps, no movement, just the eerie stillness of the deserted school. But something was off. The air felt heavier, almost suffocating, and the lights overhead were buzzing louder than before, flickering every few seconds as if they were on the verge of going out. The whole building felt wrong, like it wasn't just empty, but waiting for something. I reached the main hallway, skidding to a stop in front of the double doors that led outside. Relief washed over me as I reached for the handle. Finally, I could get out, leave this creepy school behind, and never look back. But the door didn't budge. I tried again, yanking harder, but it was no use. It was locked. My stomach dropped. This wasn't possible. Asterisk, it wasn't supposed to be locked star. The main doors were always unlocked after school until late, at least until the janitors finished cleaning up. I rattled the handle again, harder this time, as if that would somehow change things. Locked. Completely locked. I felt panic rising in my chest, threatening to take over. I had been so sure I could just walk out and leave, but now I was trapped. I banged on the door, calling out in the hopes that maybe someone, a teacher, a janitor, anyone, was still around to hear me. "Hey, is anyone there?" I shouted, my voice echoing down the empty hallway. No answer. The only response was the faint hum of the overhead lights, which flickered again, dimming for just a second before buzzing back to life. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my fear in check. I had to stay calm. There had to be another way out. The school had multiple exits, and if I could just make it to one of them, I could get out of this nightmare. I turned and started walking quickly down the hallway, heading toward the back of the building where there was another set of doors. As I moved, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that shadow again. But there was nothing. Just the long, empty corridor stretching behind me. The school felt like a completely different place at night. It was the same building I'd walked through 1,000 times, but without the noise and the people, it felt like a hollow shell. Every sound seemed amplified, every shadow more threatening. The classrooms were dark, the doors closed, and the only light came from the occasional flickering of the fluorescent bulbs overhead. I could hear the wind howling faintly outside, but inside the school, it was dead silent. I finally reached the back hallway, where the exit doors were. My heart pounded as I grabbed the handle, praying that this door would be open. It wasn't. Locked, just like the front doors. No, I muttered under my breath, shaking the handle again in frustration. I banged on the door with my fist, as if that would somehow make it unlock itself. But it didn't. I was trapped. I leaned against the door, trying to calm down, but it was no use. My heart was racing, and my mind was spinning. I couldn't understand how this was happening. Why were all the doors locked? I hadn't heard anyone lock them, and the janitors should have still been around. None of it made sense. I pulled out my phone, my hands shaking. Maybe I could call someone, let them know I was stuck in the school. But when I glanced at the screen, my stomach sank even further. No signal. Of course, I stared at my phone in disbelief, trying to process what was happening. I was alone, locked inside the school, with no way to contact anyone. And the strangest part was that none of this should have been possible. I'd been here late before, and the doors were never locked this early. And the figure, no, I didn't even want to think about that. Not yet. Suddenly I heard it again. The footsteps. They were faint at first, but they were definitely there, echoing softly down the hallway behind me. My blood ran cold. I spun around, my heart hammering in my chest. But the hallway was empty. Just the same dim lights casting long shadows on the floor. But the footsteps didn't stop. They were getting closer. I backed up slowly, my eyes fixed on the hallway, waiting for something, anything to appear. The sound of shoes on the linoleum grew louder, more deliberate, like someone was walking right toward me. But no one was there. The hallway was completely empty. I couldn't take it anymore. Panic took over, and I turned and ran. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away. Away from the footsteps, away from the figure, away from whatever was happening in this school. My feet pounded against the floor as I raced through the hallways, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. As I ran, the lights flickered again, plunging the hall into brief moments of darkness before buzzing back on. Every flicker made my heart jump, and every shadow seemed to move in the corner of my vision. I kept looking behind me, expecting to see the figure right on my heels, but there was nothing. I rounded a corner and stopped dead in my tracks. The hallway in front of me stretched out long and empty, just like all the others. But at the far end, barely visible in the dim light, was the shadow. It wasn't moving. It just stood there, still as a statue, its outline barely visible but unmistakable. I felt my stomach twist with fear. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to look away. But I had to do something. I couldn't just stand there, waiting for it to come closer. I took a step back, my heart racing, and as I did, the lights flickered again, and the shadow moved. It took one slow, deliberate step toward me, and I could feel my blood turn to ice. The figure wasn't rushing at me. It wasn't even trying to hide anymore. It was just walking like it knew I had nowhere to go. The lights flickered again, longer this time, and when they came back on, the figure was closer. Too close. I turned and ran again, faster than before, not caring where I was going, just needing to get away from whatever was chasing me. My breath came in ragged gasps, my legs burning as I sprinted through the endless maze of hallways. I had to find a way out. I had to get out of this school before it caught up with me. But the footsteps were getting louder, and no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't outrun them. I could hear the footsteps echoing behind me, relentless, growing louder with each passing second. Every nerve in my body was screaming to run faster, but it felt like no matter how fast I moved, the distance between me and whatever was chasing me was shrinking. I could feel it. Asterisk was getting closer. My heart pounded in my chest, and my legs were burning from the sprint, but fear drove me forward. I didn't care where I was running. I just needed to get away from it. I turned down another hallway, skidding on the slick linoleum floor, and almost slammed into the wall. The school's hallways were like a maze in the dim, flickering light, every corner looking the same, every door locked tight. I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see the shadow closing in, but the hallway remained empty. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my own frantic breathing and those footsteps, slow, methodical, like they didn't need to rush because they knew they'd catch me eventually. I spotted a door up ahead, one of the smaller side exits near the gym. Hope surged through me. Maybe this door would be open. Maybe, just maybe, I could slip out and escape this nightmare. I bolted toward it, the exit sign glowing dimly above the door like a promise of safety. My hands were shaking as I reached for the handle, and for a brief second, I hesitated. The footsteps had stopped. The hallway behind me was completely silent. I grabbed the door handle and pulled. It didn't move. I tried again, this time yanking with all my strength, but it wouldn't budge. I could feel panic rising in my chest as I jiggled the handle, my breath coming in short, desperate gasps. Come on, I muttered under my breath, trying to force the door open. Locked. I slammed my fist against the door in frustration. How could every exit be locked? It didn't make any sense. I'd been in this school countless times after hours, and the doors were never locked this early. Something was wrong. Asterisk, seriously asterisk wrong. And the realization that I was trapped hit me like a ton of bricks. Suddenly, the lights overhead flickered again, casting long, eerie shadows across the hallway. I spun around, my heart racing, expecting to see the shadowy figure right behind me. But there was nothing. The hallway stretched out empty, just like before. But that feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I backed away from the door, my eyes darting down the hallway, scanning for any sign of movement. The silence was unnerving, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The footsteps had stopped, but I knew better than to think that meant I was safe. It was out there, somewhere, waiting. I took a few shaky steps backward, my mind racing. I needed to think. There had to be another way out. The school was huge, with multiple floors and exits. Maybe if I made it to the second floor, I could find a window to crawl out of or a fire escape. But as soon as I took a step toward the stairwell, I heard it. Knock, knock, knock. The sound was soft at first, almost like someone was gently tapping on a door. I froze, my blood running cold. It came again. Asterisk knock. Knock, knock, asterisk, louder this time, echoing through the empty hallway. The sound was coming from somewhere nearby, but I couldn't pinpoint where. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. Hello? I called out, my voice shaky. I wasn't even sure why I spoke. Maybe part of me still hoped that this was all some weird prank, that someone would jump out and tell me I'd been imagining it all. But there was no answer, just that knocking. Steady, deliberate. I slowly turned around, my eyes scanning the hallway, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the sweat on my palms as I gripped my phone tightly. The light from my phone's screen barely illuminated the space in front of me, and every shadow seemed to shift and move in the dim light. Then I saw it. At the far end of the hallway, near one of the classroom doors, a shadow shifted. It was faint, but it was there, dark and still, standing just out of reach of the flickering light. I couldn't breathe. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, silent and watching. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I took a step back, my eyes locked on the figure. The knocking had stopped, replaced by the oppressive silence that hung in the air, thick and heavy. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct in my body was telling me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The doors were locked, and the figure was blocking the hallway behind me. I felt trapped, like an animal caught in a cage. The figure took a step forward. My breath caught in my throat. It wasn't fast, it moved slowly, deliberately, like it had all the time in the world. The shadowy form seemed to blur at the edges, flickering in and out of focus with the dim light. But it was getting closer. Too close. I backed up until I was pressed against the locked door, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. "Leave me alone," I whispered, my voice barely audible. The figure didn't stop. It kept coming, slow and steady, its dark form looming larger as it approached. I grabbed my phone, my fingers shaking as I tried to call someone, anyone, for help. But when I looked down at the screen, my heart sank. No signal. Of course, I was alone. The figure was almost halfway down the hallway now, its movements eerily calm, as if it knew I had nowhere to run. The air around me felt heavy, almost suffocating, and I could feel the fear rising in my chest like a wave, threatening to drown me. Then, suddenly, the lights flickered again, brighter this time, and for a split second, the hallway was bathed in light. And the figure was gone, just like that. 1 second, it was there, creeping closer, and the next, it had vanished. The hallway was empty, just as it had been before. The shadows were still there, long and dark, but the figure, asterisk the thing asterisk, was gone. I stood there, gasping for breath, my body shaking from the adrenaline. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was it real? Had I really seen it? Or was my mind playing tricks on me? I wanted to believe that it was all in my head, that the stress and fear were making me imagine things. But deep down, I knew the truth. It had been real. The shadow, the footsteps, the knocking, they were real. And whatever it wasn't done with me. I forced myself to move, pushing off the door and stumbling down the hallway. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stay there. I couldn't wait for it to come back. My body was shaking, my legs weak, but I kept moving, turning down another corridor, desperate to find a way out. But as I rounded the corner, I stopped in my tracks. The hallway in front of me was completely dark, the lights overhead flickering weakly. And at the far end of the hallway, barely visible in the dim light, was the shadow. It was waiting for me. There it was again. The shadow, waiting for me at the far end of the hallway. I stood frozen in place, staring at it, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't want to believe it was real, but deep down, I knew it was. This was no trick of the light, no figment of my imagination. That thing, whatever it was real, and it was watching me. My mind screamed for me to run, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The shadow didn't move, didn't lunge or rush toward me. It just stood there, as if it was waiting for me to make the first move. But the longer I stood there, the more I could feel its presence. Heavy, suffocating, like it was taking up all the air in the hallway. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to take a step back. The moment I moved, the shadow shifted. Not fast, but deliberate, taking one slow step forward. My stomach twisted into knots. I took another step back, and it took another step toward me. Every movement it made was slow, calculated, as if it knew it had all the time in the world. This was no longer just about escaping. It was playing with me. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't let it corner me. My body finally broke free from the paralysis of fear, and I turned and ran. My feet hit the ground hard, the sound of my footsteps echoing off the walls as I sprinted down the hall. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see how close it was. All I could hear was the pounding of my heartbeat and the sound of my own ragged breathing. The school felt like it was closing in around me, the hallways twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. I had no idea where I was going anymore. I just needed to get away. I rounded a corner and nearly slipped, catching myself just in time. The lights overhead flickered again, dimming for a moment before buzzing back on, casting long, flickering shadows along the floor. The whole building felt alive, like it was pulsing with some kind of dark energy. I kept running, but the air felt thicker now, like I was moving through water. Every breath burned in my lungs, and my legs felt like they were turning to lead, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't let it catch me. I risked a glance over my shoulder, and my heart nearly stopped. The shadow was there, closer than before, moving toward me at a steady pace. It didn't run, didn't rush, but no matter how fast I went, it was always gaining on me. Its dark form seemed to blur and shift, like it wasn't fully solid, flickering in and out of the shadows. The sight of it made my stomach churn, my fears spiking higher with every passing second. I had to find somewhere to hide. I spotted an open classroom door just ahead and darted toward it, skidding to a stop as I slipped inside. I slammed the door shut behind me and locked it, my hands shaking as I turned the deadbolt. I stepped back, pressing my back against the door, trying to catch my breath. The room was dark, only the faint light from the hallway seeping through the cracks in the door. For a moment, I just stood there, gasping for breath, my body trembling with fear and exhaustion. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the lights overhead. My heart was still pounding, my mind racing. I had no idea what was happening. How could this thing be real? How could I be running from something that didn't even seem human? I listened intently, waiting for the sound of footsteps, for the shadow to find me. But all I could hear was the faint buzzing of the lights and the distant echo of my own breathing. Maybe I'd lost it. Maybe it hadn't seen where I'd gone. I slowly crept toward the window on the far side of the classroom, hoping I could use it to get out. The window was high up, but if I could open it, I might be able to climb out, get away from whatever was chasing me. My hands were still shaking as I reached for the latch and tried to open it. But the window wouldn't budge. It was stuck. No, I muttered, pulling harder on the window. It didn't move. I was trapped. I turned back to the door, dread creeping up my spine. The hallway was quiet, too quiet. The figure wasn't making any noise. It wasn't pounding on the door or trying to break in, but I knew it was there. I could feel it. Then, out of nowhere, the knocking started again. Knock, knock, knock. My stomach flipped. It wasn't the normal knocking you hear on a door. It was softer, like someone was tapping their fingers against the door, slow and deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. I pressed my back against the wall, my heart racing. The knocking continued, steady like it was in no rush, like it knew I had nowhere to go. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do, but the fear was paralyzing. All I could do was stare at the door, waiting for it to burst open, waiting for the shadow to come for me. But the door didn't move. The knocking just kept going. Knock, knock, knock. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit there and wait for it to get me. I forced myself to move, creeping along the wall toward the back of the classroom, looking for anything I could use to defend myself. A chair, a book, anything. But as soon as I took a step, the knocking stopped. Dead silence. I froze, my body tense, my breath caught in my throat. The room felt colder now, the air thick with an oppressive weight. I could feel the shadow's presence, even though I couldn't see it. It was out there, waiting. Then the door handle rattled. I took another step back, my heart pounding in my ears. The handle rattled again, harder this time, like someone was trying to get in. My whole body tensed as I stared at the door, waiting for it to swing open. But it didn't. Instead, the lights in the classroom flickered again, plunging the room into darkness for a few terrifying seconds. When they came back on, I saw it. The shadow was inside the room. It was standing in the corner, barely visible, but it was there. My blood ran cold. I didn't understand how it had gotten in, how it could just appear like that, but it was real, and it was closer than ever. I backed up slowly, my legs trembling. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there, watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. And then it took a step toward me. My heart leapt into my throat. I turned and ran again, heading for the back door of the classroom. I didn't even think. I just moved. My hand grabbed the handle, and I threw the door open, rushing out into the hallway. The lights in the hallway flickered as I ran, casting long shadows on the walls. I could feel it behind me, feel the weight of its presence pressing down on me. Even though I didn't look back, I knew it was there. I just had to keep running. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow was always just a few steps behind. My lungs were burning. Every breath I took felt like fire in my chest, and my legs were trembling so badly I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep running. But I couldn't stop. Not when I knew that shadow, asterisk the thing asterisk, was still after me. My body moved on instinct, my feet pounding against the linoleum floor as I darted through the hallways, the lights flickering ominously overhead. I had no plan, no sense of direction. The school felt like an endless maze, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. I turned down one hallway after another, but no matter how far I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was going in circles. Every door I passed was locked, every exit blocked. I was trapped. The lights flickered again, and in that brief moment of darkness, I heard it. Footsteps. They were mine. They were heavy, slow, and deliberate, echoing through the hallway behind me. My heart raced, panic rising in my chest. I knew I couldn't outrun it forever. That thing was toying with me, dragging out the chase, waiting for me to wear myself down. I rounded another corner, skidding to a stop in front of a familiar door, the gym. It was one of the few places in the school with multiple exits, and maybe, just maybe, one of them would be unlocked. I didn't have time to think about it. I grabbed the handle and yanked the door open, slipping inside and slamming it shut behind me. The gym was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the emergency exit signs above the doors. The air was thick and stale, and the sound of my footsteps echoed off the high walls as I made my way across the empty court. My eyes darted around the room, scanning for any sign of movement, but the gym was as silent as a tomb. For a brief moment, I let myself hope. Maybe I'd lost it. Maybe the shadow had given up. But even as I thought it, I knew it wasn't true. That thing didn't give up. It was playing a game, and I was still part of it. I headed for the exit at the far end of the gym, praying that this door would be unlocked. I reached for the handle, my hands shaking, and pulled. It didn't move. Locked, just like the others. I let out a frustrated groan, slamming my fist against the door. How could this be happening? Why were all the exits locked? My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. There had to be a way out. There had to be. But with each locked door, each dead end, the panic inside me grew stronger. The gym felt colder now, the air thick with tension. My skin prickled with goosebumps, and I could feel that familiar weight pressing down on me again. The sensation that I wasn't alone. I turned around slowly, my breath catching in my throat. At the far end of the gym, standing just inside the door I had come through, was the shadow. It was still, dark, and impossibly tall, its form barely visible in the dim light. My stomach twisted into knots. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. It was just standing there, watching me, waiting. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The only sound was the faint hum of the lights and the distant echo of my own heartbeat. I felt trapped, like an animal cornered by a predator. No matter where I went, it was always there, always one step ahead, always watching. Then, slowly, the shadow took a step forward. I backed up instinctively, my back pressing against the cold metal door behind me. My heart was pounding so loudly, I was sure it could hear it. The shadow took another step, and then another, moving closer with each one, its form flickering in and out of focus like a bad signal. This was it. I had nowhere to run. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan, but the fear was overwhelming. I was trapped, and the shadow was closing in. But then something strange happened. As the shadow moved closer, I noticed something I hadn't before. It wasn't just a figure. It was familiar. The way it moved, the way it flickered, it wasn't random. It was almost like it was following my movements, mimicking them. I stared at the shadow, my mind reeling. How could it be? Was it me? The thought hit me like a punch to the gut. All this time, I had been running from it, trying to escape. But what if the shadow wasn't something chasing me? What if it was something else entirely, something connected to me? I swallowed hard, my breath shaky. My legs felt weak, and I had to lean against the door to keep myself from collapsing. The shadow had stopped moving. It just stood there, motionless, waiting for me to make the next move. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct was telling me to run, to get as far away from it as possible, but something inside me told me to stop, to face it. I took a deep breath, my hands trembling, and took a step forward. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there watching. I took another step, my heart pounding in my chest. I was close enough now that I could see the faint outline of the figure, its edges blurry like smoke. It wasn't solid. It wasn't real, at least not in the way I had thought. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The shadow didn't respond. I swallowed hard, taking another step forward. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what was happening, but nothing made sense. All I knew was that this thing, this shadow, wasn't just some random figure haunting me. It was tied to me somehow. I reached out, my hand trembling as I stretched it toward the shadow. My fingers hovered just inches away from it, and for a moment I hesitated. But I had to know. I had to understand. I took a deep breath and touched it. The moment my fingers brushed against the shadow, everything changed. A wave of cold washed over me, so intense it felt like I had been plunged into ice. My vision blurred, and for a brief moment, I couldn't see or hear anything. It was like the world around me had disappeared, replaced by a vast emptiness. And then, just as suddenly, it was over. I blinked, my vision clearing, and found myself standing in the gym alone. The shadow was gone. I looked around, confused, my heart still racing. The gym was exactly as it had been before, silent and empty. But the shadow, the thing that had been chasing me, was gone. I couldn't feel its presence anymore. It was like it had never been there at all. But something had changed. I could feel it deep inside me, a cold knot in my chest. The shadow wasn't gone. It was still with me, but in a different way. It wasn't chasing me anymore, because it didn't need to. Because it was part of me now. I stumbled back, leaning against the door for support, my mind spinning. The shadow hadn't been some outside force. It had been connected to me all along, feeding off my fear, my panic. The more I had run, the stronger it had become. And now it was inside me. I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what would happen next. But as I stood there alone in the empty gym, I knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over.